Hello, everyone. Today we're joined by Karthik Pulugurtha, the Managing Director, India of the Fish Welfare Initiative. He has a background in animal welfare, having also managed the Animal Law Center at the National Academy of Legal Studies. He has also worked as a research and livelihoods consultant for MPs from Telugu Desam Party. We are very excited to talk today with Karthik about the amazing work that Fish Welfare Initiative does in India and fish welfare more broadly. So to start us off, what does the Fish Welfare Institute do?
Um, well, there's a lot of things we do. I'm very excited to be here. Um, I'm really looking forward to this. So, to get us started on that question, I think the most important thing we do is we work directly with producers, and what we essentially do with them is we kind of get them on board on what we are calling the Alliance for Responsible Aquaculture. What this means is once they're part of the alliance, they're meant to reduce stocking densities. They're meant to take corrective actions whenever there's any sign that the fish have any trouble with water quality or any kind of conditions that allow them to live a less than perfect life, right? So we're still working on getting towards something good, but we have something fairly advanced right now in terms of a standard that gets us to improving the lives of fish. So that's predominantly what we do. We're also researching a bunch about how to help these fish live really good lives. That's part of what we call our standard setting work. And there's just the usual rigmarole of working in India. We work with governments and various other stakeholders on the ground to enable everything from happening, basically.
Yeah, and why fish? And I ask this because I want to know how fish welfare maps out in the field of animal welfare writ large. Is it, according to you, the most important, tractable, or neglected?
It is all those things. I think it is highly neglected. Um, it is fairly tractable. I think we've shown a lot of promise in scaling up fairly quickly. When I started out, I was thinking we'd have serious conversations about scalability 3, 4, maybe even 5 years down the road, right? But we've started having like really good conversations, really good strategies being put together, connected to scalability, like about a few months ago. We had our first really good plan. It's hard to see when you start work in on a project like this. It takes a certain amount of time to be able to see with clarity, if you know what I mean. And we got there 2 years in, and that's really saying something. So scalability, and then the neglect. I don't have to tell anyone about the neglect. Especially in developing countries, Asia in general has not had a lot of work done on animal welfare broadly. Fish welfare, forget about it. No one has touched it before. So there is a lot of neglect here, and this neglect is, should not exist, right? Think about gasping for air. These are conditions in which animals shouldn't be growing. 3 months, 4 months out of the year, conditions get so bad that these fish barely have enough oxygen to breathe. We can see physical signs of them struggling all the time, and it's just not something that should happen. And with that level of suffering and that level of neglect, I felt like this was the right area to focus on. I was super excited before I even took up the position that there was going to be some work done in the area.
Yeah, and one of the things that I've been shocked by is just why there's so much neglectedness in the area of fish welfare. We've done a lot of work in like other areas of animal welfare, whether it be with regards to chickens. And I'm sure the animal rights movement has done like a lot of work with like non-farmed animals. But why have we come to fish welfare quite late.
Yeah, that is, I think, connected to how, I was in a conversation fairly recently. I was talking to some folks from the animal movement, and they were quite legitimate questions that were being discussed, right? One of the things is, how do we raise money for this, right? This was a conversation about funding and funding for the future of the animal movement in India. And obviously, I can't speak for the rest of the world as well. I'm not part of those conversations. But as far as India is concerned, I think when we started talking about fish and shrimp, a lot of people expressed skepticism about how the community at large is gonna react to react to funding, right? Funding fish, and a lot of times we've had to learn, even within FWI, we've learned that it's important to outline that it's not just the fish you're helping, it's the environment, it's the farmer. All their interests are, kind of are things that come together basically. And at the end of the day, we are a welfare organization, and that is something that fortunately animal welfare does bring stability to farmers right now. Fortunately, not unfortunately, I'm so sorry. Fortunately, that is something that brings us closer to brings us a win-win situation with them. So generally put, we've had to package it, and all those answers about packaging it well for funding didn't exist, right? As far as India is concerned, again, the situation is very different, say in Portugal, where most of the producers are large scale producers, and their incentives are very different, right? I think conversations about fish welfare didn't even start with animal welfare folks, they started with the industry. I might be true about this, and this is, certification, certification folks and best aquaculture practices always had some element of fish welfare in them. So these conversations kind of started with the industry, and they kind of were taken seriously by the animal movement. I'm so glad that a handful of organizations are working on the issue right now. I think it's going to take a lot of time for it to kind of scale up, basically.
Yeah, and what does most of the public see fish as? Do they consider it to be an animal that's sentient and can feel pain? Personally, like I've been careful around insects since a young age, and I couldn't even see a dead insect suffer in front of me. And so naturally, I felt the same for fish, and especially after I had a pet fish that I had to take care of. But I'm curious to know what other people think about fish.
Yeah, it's different for different folks, right? I didn't venture into it when you last asked the question. I didn't want to say, well, it's hard for people to care about fish, so there's that. Because I don't think that's why. I think it's mostly people who work in the animal space, assuming that people won't care, or kind of not wanting to package it a certain way. And there are legitimate reasons for not wanting to package it, because welfare in and of itself, work associated with welfare has not been very popular in the animal protection space for a very long time. So there's a whole lot of issues. I think that's where the majority of the problem came from. That's my opinion. I understand that others would have different opinions from that. But having said that, I think there's a lot of folks who do care, right? I can think about my friends in the Jain community who are like, I know someone who would stop if there was an ant in front of his car or something like that, right? For a lot of people, all life is precious, and they don't discern, and this is part of the religious philosophy for some folks, and for some folks it's just part of their own personal philosophy. So I wouldn't go out there and say that fish aren't important. I think people, for people who care about animals any less, honestly. But I think there is a certain stubbornness, I will say, with the people who handle fish. That is something that behavior is something that's very hard to change, because they think it's just fish don't feel pain sort of activity is very prevalent. Having said that, I think in India, at least, a lot of people, when you ask them, do you think fish feel pain, they'll answer in the affirmative. But they've just gotten used to picking the easy road of handling fish. Whenever a farmer harvests, he harvests from per acre, he harvests something like 2,000, 3,000 fish, right? But there's so many small fish that just become collateral damage to that process. So many. I mean, like, I'm talking 10,000, 15,000. I mean, we're not even like talking small numbers. So people are just inoculated to this process because they're just dealing with this suffering, and it's the easy road to take.
Yeah, and why does FWI engage in the institutional route as opposed to convincing people? Are there casteist undertones in fish advocacy as well? And maybe focusing more on institutions can help prevent that from happening.
I'm not sure if I could answer to the caste question specifically, but I've always found, not being a scholar in that area, I can't really delve too deeply there. But having looked into the economic status of farmers for a very long time, I can answer this question from that perspective, basically. I think changing the way institutions work around this is kind of necessary, because in the animal movement, we talk a lot about industry internalizing cost, right? But when it comes to developing countries, especially countries like India, where there's a lot of poor and middle income folks working for basically the producers, but there's other parts of the industry which are a little bit more opulent, right? We have to really figure out who to ask to internalize the cost. Unfortunately, the farmers have very little in the way of resources to internalize anything. And we are unfortunately a country where a lot of farmers commit suicides, and there's just a lot of environmental catastrophe that happens all the time. I mean, like, environmental disruptions of the agriculture economy is just spiking very badly these days, right? So with all those concerns in mind, I think building institutions that support a farmer to take care of their fish better is, in my opinion, a very logical and scalable approach, basically, because otherwise we're just looking at a law that can never be enforced, even if a court would agree that fish are sentient and goes about setting standards. Unless there's someone on the ground to really do something, it's not going to change. And that's why we're here and doing what we're doing.
Yeah, okay, so I am back. I wanted to now ask the next question, which is about where most of India's fish farming actually happens and what does demand look like?
Right. So most of India's fish farming happens in Andhra Pradesh. We're looking at somewhere between 36 and 38% of all production happening in this state, right? The second largest producer is West Bengal. And they're one of the larger consumers as well. Weirdly enough, Andhra is a large producer, but not a large consumer. Right? And most of the demand is concentrated between the states of Orissa, West Bengal, and the 7 states in the Northeast. This is the kind of demand geography for freshwater fish, right? Well, what does it look like? There's a lot of interest in purchasing live fish. There's a lot of interest in purchasing low costing fish. It depends on really which state you're in, right? In Orissa, they want to buy them for as low as possible. Orissa being one of the poorer states. And unfortunately, this is seen as a protein that's easily accessible for vast majority of the population. So price is a big factor in Orissa. But when you look at the Northeast, quality becomes a more important factor there. Even though they're poorer states, there's always been an interest in spending more when it comes to food. West Bengal is somewhere in the middle, right? So that's kind of what demand looks like for fish. So the production happens here. So you can imagine a whole lot of transportation figures into the framework, basically. And as I've said before, there's an interest in purchasing live fish. That means even though this is a very small percent of the trade, it means more suffering because of that particular interest. And there's nothing in it for consumers. Honestly, they purchase live fish thinking that they're getting something more healthy, but the amount of stress and the amount of contamination that the fish undergo as a result of transporting them in the way they're transported, I'm fairly certain that nothing good comes out of that.
Yeah, and why does this mainly happen in Andhra Pradesh? Is it because it's a coastal state where a lot of fish agriculture happens? Because I'm sure there are also other coastal states too.
There's a bunch of reasons for it. One of the main reasons is that there's a lot of rivers that run through Andhra Pradesh. There's a lot of availability of water. So a lot of aquaculture zones are kind of set up around the rivers and one of some of the larger lakes, basically, right? So that's where most of aquaculture is concentrated, freshwater aquaculture is concentrated. So there's a very nice canal irrigation system that works out for these two states, for this particular state. Having said that, there's also been a shift from rice production to fish production. Now, rice production, as you might know, requires a lot of water already. So there's been a lot of shift from this place, Andhra Pradesh, grew a lot of rice, right? A lot of farmers would grow rice here, but because of certain factors connected to, very unique to India, MSP prices not being stable, markets not being very accessible to farmers to purchase rice, the rice market has not been very predictable or friendly to the average farmer, especially to some of the smaller farmers. And you've seen a lot of those factors pushing people to looking for something with that gives them more economic stability. But the weird thing is, fish farming doesn't give you economic stability all that much, at least the way they're doing it right now. The way the vast majority of them take it up, it's not conducive. They're just increasing the capacity of the pathogens in this area. They're damaging the soils. There's a whole lot of degradation as a result of fish farming and shrimp farming, which no one really understands because it would take a long-term view to get a grasp on these things.
Yeah, and how is the fish industry structured in India? Is it more decentralized where, as you said, like many farmers can just do it on their own, as opposed to like one or two big corporations that carry it out as it probably exists in like other countries?
Yeah, it's super decentralized. Not decentralized, like super decentralized. It's like we were talking to some corporations and we were asking them, like, do you know where your fish come from? And they were like, yeah, there's 7 people. I checked, there's 7 or 8 people between me and the fish farmer. So not only is it decentralized, it's also broken in many ways. So there's lots and lots of farmers who do it in specific aquaculture zones. So there is some regulation around this. It is licensed. For instance, it is a licensed activity, and people try to kind of do it in a way where they acquire the license and then take up the activity. So there is some oversight, but the oversight is very minimal. It doesn't doesn't really do much for anybody, whether the environment or for the welfare of the fish just yet, right? We're trying to change all this, obviously. And it's many farmers. I would, if I were to be guessing, and I'm guessing really, that at least 4 to 5% of the population derives their livelihood. We have actual numbers about how much of the population derives their livelihood from agrarian or agriculture-based systems, and that's over 50% for sure. So we're not looking at we're not looking at a situation like in the US where 3% or 2% of people produce food. We're looking at vast majority of the people taking up this activity, and then there's all the people they hire and all that stuff. So it is a big chunk of the population involved in the activity, especially in a state like Andhra Pradesh. And yeah, it is super decentralized. There's ponds as small as 1 acre or half acre, and there's ponds as big as 500 acres and 600 acres. So it's just, you get all kinds.
Yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about the regulations that are currently in place. Are there any that have been put into force by the Indian government on fish farming to better their welfare?
I would say not yet. We're working on it. We might be close to doing some stuff actually. But these things take a lot of time, basically, right? There are suggestions, for instance. None of them are binding. The state of Uttarakhand has a lot of positive suggestions for farmers on best management practices, and a lot of those practices will contribute to animal welfare. Basically, nowhere in that text would you see the word animal welfare. But having said that, these practices would contribute to animal welfare. No specific decision has been made specifically for welfare, but as I said, there's a lot of advice that exists along in that realm, wherein they could be recommending practices that would contribute to its welfare. But having said that, none of these are perfect. They're not as robust. The problem is that it is a system at the end of the day, and tinkering with the system is really hard, especially because it's an artificially created system. It's you need to kind of understand what happens in that underwater ecosystem fairly clearly. What are the different correlations in there, and causal links are very difficult to tease out. And India, unfortunately, has not invested sufficiently to tease out those connections. And in every country would have to do it for themselves, really. Maybe there's there's a regional coalition that's possible to get these details out. But you see, the unique weather patterns here means that someone here would have to do it. And that's some of the work we're taking up as well. I think our research has been fairly promising so far, and I'd like to see more of that happening from the government as well. And only then, when we have something specific, only then can we start thinking about policy, really. Something specific to the species that live here. If I were to just think about what fish, which particular species, most has been figured out for, is the salmon, right? Obviously, the Atlantic salmon. And the least would be something like the Indian major carp, which people just haven't figured enough out to really give an answer here, basically. We know more about the common carp, the silver carp, because of farming happening in China, and there their burgeoning interest in animal welfare in general. So we're using, there's research from Bangladesh that's also fairly interesting. So yeah, we need to pick up as a country. We have a lot to learn from these countries and figuring out animal welfare, both from the research and from the policy end of things.
Yeah, and I'd also imagine that it's quite difficult to advocate for fish welfare directly and say that because they suffer, we should regulate the practice. I don't think many people would listen to that. Is there a different way to go about doing that by saying there are reasons you should regulate fishing that's beneficial for humans, that has knock-on benefits for fish welfare? So, for example, regulations against overfishing or pushing for better water quality in these ponds.
Right. I don't think it's that hard actually in India. The language of animal welfare kind of soaked into the machinery a little bit. It's one of the positive things about the country. That there's just a lot of. I mean, we are an animist culture still, right? A lot of our religion has animist undertones. As a result of it, there has been a lot of percolation of that ethos and philosophy into the minds of the people, and hence and hence you see some of these elements both in law and in the constitution as well. Now, having said that, it's not easy to have these conversations. It's possible. I have gone up to some of the high ranking officials in the country and spoken to them about fish welfare and received nothing but warm repertoire, basically, right? It was possible to talk to them. They didn't see a way of doing this just yet, because, as I said, there's just a lot of need for research at the moment. I think that's the first step, and if there is good research, and that's the trick with India, if there's good research and Indian researchers and institutions are kind of producing that research, there's an easy road from there to getting policies implemented. And I think something like that is being tried with chickens right now, to get them out of cages, from what I understand. So there is a nice there are a set of interesting possibilities that are unique to India.
Yeah, and I think I really agree with the whole needing Indian students to do a lot of the research, because I think one of the big advantages that the West has is it has students there doing research about the problems that are unique to that region, and having more people from here find out ways to actually improve animal welfare is so important. A lot of farmers, you know, also face high costs as a result of their fish falling ill due to parasitic disease. I know that stunning, for example, is a very expensive process, but is there a way to tip the balance and make it such that it's in their profit incentives to treat fish more humanely?
Yes, I think it is currently within that ambit. Honestly, we've not the species we're growing. So let's just start with the systems, right? They're mostly semi-intensive, extensive, with a burgeoning segment of intensive farming. That's kind of how it looks right now, right? Now, intensive farmers are very hard to work with, as you can imagine. They farm species like Pangasius, like the catfish species, and they're known to stock notoriously high stocking densities. I think the best approach with these farmers, I'd say, is bans on specific species and specific stocking densities and all that. Basically, I think there's just no possibility of a dialogue here. Honestly, it's just harmful for everyone involved: the people consuming those fish, the producers, because they get into losses fairly easily because of the kind of disease prevalence in that particular segment. It's like gambling almost, like many governments in India, state governments in India found it easy to ban gambling, and I think this should be fairly similar in its conception. So once we just come out of that intensive belt, when you work with semi-intensive and extensive farmers, I think it's very much in the interest of the farmer to take care of their fish well. We've recently done an analysis with very few farmers, nothing that we can solidly perch on top of just yet. We, just for our internal understanding, we've kind of looked into 10 farmers and tried to understand what their incomes look like and how much their input costs have reduced as a result of our intervention. And it looks positive, right? Now, the sample size is too small for us to really validate this just yet, but it is promising in that particular round, right? That we could be, by taking care of the fish better, we could be reducing the input costs of the farmers. Not just that, I think we could also be causing a whole host of other benefits as well in the future. Excuse me. We could be thinking about certification, accessing premier markets. All kinds of benefits could stem from kind of doing this. I think they could access, one of the things that happens for the aquaculture industry is that, not the aquaculture industry perhaps, but fish farming specifically, is that no one's interested in giving them insurance because it's considered both highly risky, and also the cost is too high because you need to send someone who knows quite a bit about verifying if someone's made a false claim or an accurate claim, basically. So it's hard to get insurance as well. But if they make these things more predictable, and if they make, if they're following welfare-based practices, they could make themselves less risky for a loan giving bank or an insurance company as well. So there's a lot of benefits that could be burgeoning from doing the right thing here, I think. So as I said, this is very much possible with a semi-intensive segment of the business, right? It is also possible with a non-intensive segment as well. So there's a lot of extensive farmers where fish suffering is already low because they stock so little, but they do a lot of things that that are pretty bad for their well-being, simply because they don't know. They're super far away from anything resembling good information, basically. So they're doing these things in more remote parts. So there's a lot of improvement that we can make just with training, and like a very like low touch intervention could be set up there. But again, this is something that we're thinking about. We've not been able to implement anything connected to extensive farms just yet, but we're thinking about it.
Yeah, so you pointed out that there is limited research and we still need to do more about that. But do you mind naming a few more interventions that fish farmers in India should take? Especially given that we know very little about their experiences of pain. How do we make sure that we're doing more good than harm?
Right. I think on the safe end of the stick, right? I mean, like what is easy to determine at this point is stock less than 2,500 fish per acre if you're farming Indian major carp. I mean, that I can say with a lot of certainty at this point. Less than 2,500 per acre for IMCs. If you're doing IMC shrimp polyculture, then make sure that your segment, you're kind of partitioning these things sufficiently enough. Use aerators if you're doing IMC shrimp polyculture. For 3 hours during the day and 3 hours in the evening. This is something we know fairly well as well. Make sure that you're not overfeeding the fish, we've clearly seen a correlation between feeding fish, I mean, like excessive feeding of fish, and spikes in phytoplankton levels, and that causes oxygen depletion basically in water. So don't overfeed your fish. Follow a weight-based feeding regime so that your fish are eating sufficient amount of, I mean, like only have access to sufficient amounts, and there's no wastage basically that's causing the water quality to go bad. Similarly, we know that we know certain things about how much the oxygen levels ought to be. Those are boilerplate. You can find them fairly easily, but these are some of the practices that we're working with. Water exchange is another important factor. If you get a pond, make sure that you are capable of doing water exchange, basically. A lot of farmers can't do this. As a result, they're helpless when an adverse situation occurs, basically, right? The capability of exchanging water is quite high on my list, I'd say. And pond preparation, everyone doing pond preparation every year. That's another thing. So you need to dry your pond for a month and apply agricultural lime and make sure that you're kind of, restarting the whole system, basically. This reduces parasites, very harmful parasites, doing major harm both to your bottom line and to the well-being of the fish, right? So pond prep is an important factor. I also know that a lot of farmers are incapable of doing pond prep because of access to water being bad in the state. This is something that they should work together to get the government to change the situation and make sure that this is something that changes. So these are some things that we discovered do work with absolute clarity. But having said that, there's a lot more to figure out. We started with looking into feeding practices, and now we're looking at how fertilizers, how they use fertilizers could also have a similar effect, basically. What quantity should they be using them in? What is over fertilization of the pond, and what is under fertilization doing? All that we're looking into right now. So there's so many practices, and we need to find out what good practices for each one of those practices are. And that's the work we're engaged in. And I'm super happy that we're doing that part of it as we kind of scale up our work with farmers. So we're confident that what we have so far is doing enough good that we can start intervene, start taking up interventions already. Anything we learn, we just put that on top of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned shrimp, I think, for a second. And one of the things I've read about is that if you don't do aeration properly, the shrimp will, with 100% certainty, die. And so that's a reason for why farmers take it very seriously to ensure that welfare standards are high. Is that different for fish?
Oh, yeah. They are, the way to know what differentiate a shrimp farm from a fish farm is a shrimp farm is usually decked out with aerators and border nets and whatnot and everything. It's like perfectly, it looks like something from another country almost, right? A lot of technological intervention is fairly visible on shrimp ponds. Whereas with fish pond, it just looks like a plain old earthen pond. That's the, and there's a reason for that. I think the robustness of these species, their capability to wither adverse conditions is being taken advantage of, and that shouldn't be the scenario. I think if you're raising animals, we should raise them in a way that they thrive, not exist, or that just isn't a good enough way of doing it. I mean, it rankles me as an Indian that we've ever come to this place. Like our culture is so antithetical to the way we are farming animals today. There's just so much in our culture about taking care of animals, and to come to this point where the bottom line has become more important than everything that we've learned is just not the right way, not the right position to be in, honestly.
Yeah, and now to talk a little bit about the fish that are farmed. So you brought up catfish, and one of the things that I wanted to know is, are these fish that are farmed larger in size or smaller? And I'm asking because I wanted to know whether farming larger fish compared to smaller fish might be better from a welfare perspective.
Right, right. Um, Catfish, the market connected to catfish is so what's the best word here? It's just not stable. It's there's demand for larger catfish, there's demand for smaller catfish. It's just, a lot of this, every segment there's a different thing that's prioritized. For instance, the transporter prefers smaller fish, so that they can transport more fish. But the customers and the hoteliers and the chefs, they prefer larger fish. So there's like a lot of, everyone's interest is kind of tapped into the system, but so poorly because the supply chain is so long that that it's very weird with catfish, which is a small segment of the overall production. It's, a colleague speculated that it could be about 4% or 5% of the overall segment. So, it's very weird. And to answer your question about larger fish versus smaller fish, there's just no evidence that I have that that interest of the consumer is being communicated. Or, wise on another way, another way of looking at it is that interest of, say, an animal welfare organization or a regulator being communicated to producers is fairly hard in the system. There's so few grassroots orgs and communicators that can actually transfer that information right now, especially for like a small subset of the overall production.
Yeah, and why does Fish Welfare Initiative focus more on fish farming as opposed to wild caught fish? Is it because there are a larger number of fish that are farmed?
I think there's some there, it's about the neglect really, in some ways, and there's other reasons as well. Um, there's there's a lot of suffering on both sides, right? But ocean conservation has been on the radar of a lot of people, right? But inland farming, I mean, like people don't even know that that's where their fish come from, right? A lot of people think that their fish come from the ocean when it's actually farmed, right? So there's a lot of neglect here, and that's, I think, why Haven and Tom chose to work in this area. I mean, that's my reason for sure. It's like there's a lot of conservation organizations which talk about degrading ecosystems across the coast. And that's a conversation that's entrenched into the consciousness as well. Whereas what's happening with inland aquaculture in general, not so much. I mean, apart from a handful of scholars who have commented on it every now and then, we just don't have a lot of consciousness about it.
Yeah, and I think farming fish has also shown to be very inefficient, and I think it could be because of what's used in the fish feed itself. Is it smaller fish that are fed to other fish that are being farmed?
So a lot of the commercial feed, as we call it, has FMF, or fish meal, fish oil. These are pelleted, these are pellets, basically. Now, only some of the more opulent farmers have access to pelleted feed. I mean, I don't want to get into too much about the feed science and all that stuff. There's a lot of arguments saying that the pelleted feed is more effective at helping the fish put on more weight and all that stuff. But then I want to put all that aside, basically, and talk about what actually happens. A lot more farmers than the ones who use pelleted feed use what do you say? rice husk, basically. After it's been after oil has been extracted from the husk, the remnant is basically used. The byproduct of that industry is used for feeding fish. So the most common method of feeding fish is they put this husk inside bags, put holes on them, on those bags, and then run a line along the pond, basically. So FMFO usage is fairly high with shrimp, though. Shrimp, I think shrimp farmers require that. I mean, have more resources, just like large scale fish farmers do. So every shrimp farmer, most shrimp farmers are fairly well off. And they also have access to pelleted feed and FMFO based feeds. So that's now would be where you would be looking at if you're looking at FMFO based feeds.
Yeah, and is fish very cheap in India, like compared to other meat that's sold?
I don't know, it's roughly the same. I think chicken's cheaper. You know, it's tough to say because the price variation is so high between from state to state, and nearly all the consumption happens in just one segment of the country, right? We're looking at numbers like 260, 270 per kg to 400 even in some places. So the local fish are prized by folks in the Northeast, and they're willing to pay a much higher price for local fish because they're thought of as pesticide-free and chemical-free and all that stuff, basically. So there's that idea that privileges their consumption for local fish. So it's hard to say. It's more a preference than price sensitivity that's kind of driving fish consumption, I would say.
Yeah, and the Fish Welfare Initiative does a lot of work in many countries. And so what's the big difference? I know we've talked a lot about how India is very unique, but what would you say is the main thing that sets India apart from all of the other countries you operate in?
I've already spoken a little bit about it. I think there's a legislative echo for animal welfare. There's a lot more talented people who have worked in either animal protection or have heard about it and have had some small training here. I think it's both talent and conducive conditions, basically, in the culture and in the law that set it apart, really. I think it's fantastic. I think it shows that we care. And I want the country to show that it cares a lot more than it currently does, honestly.
Yeah, and what, according to you, is the biggest challenge that the Fish Welfare Initiative currently faces, and how do you see yourself overcoming that? And as a follow-up, what's also your biggest success? I see that FWI has also covered, I think, 1 million fish, which is a really big number, and I think that's a lot of progress to be very happy about.
Yeah, for sure. I think that was a very special day. I think we'd be touching 2 million fairly soon. And I think 10 million soon after, honestly. Honestly, we have the potential to be helping billions of fish. And I think my proudest movement was the moment when I realized that we could, in theory, solidly be looking at helping billions of fish, right? When we came upon that, when we were like in that, when I first read that document, which showed like, hey, this is how much it would cost to run regular operations that help billions of fish. And I was like, that was really one of the proudest moments I've had. I think I've never imagined I'd be part of a machine that would have that much impact. I'm very grateful that I get to do this. Having said that, our biggest challenge, I think, remains talent, honestly. I think getting all these people who could help us do really good work on the ground is the biggest bottleneck. And yeah, the way to overcome is going to be that we need to work both as individuals and as organizations towards attracting more people towards the cause, attracting greater talent. That could mean a lot of things in the background, but I think is the biggest bottleneck right now. Working with producers has been surprisingly easier with the species, right? It's not the same with all animals, unfortunately, but here it's been fairly easy. I think if we're still figuring out all our cards, but I'm fairly confident that once we have we already have a reasonable amount of security when it comes to the system. Everyone thinks that that's the hardest bit, but that, unfortunately for us, wasn't the hardest bit. It's talent. It's the people who will enable that to happen. That's been the biggest bottleneck.
Yeah, and what does your timeline look like for reducing fish suffering in India?
I think we could. I project that 7 to 10 years down the road, we could be looking at influencing the industry in a big way. We could be influencing tens of thousands of farmers, basically, at that point, right? I project that if we become a fish welfare initiative becomes one of the biggest knowledge providers, right? Or in fact, even the knowledge provider in the sector, I think that would be excellent. And that's one of the goals I have of kind of having a lot of success in producing knowledge. I mean, that is kind of crucial for a country like India. If you look at GMO an anti-GMO movement in India, the scientists have really, worked together to stop genetically modified food from ever entering the system, right? There's laws that prevent that from happening. I think, even if technology were to change tomorrow, when it comes to fish, like it has with many other animals, gestation crates are a good example. Even if technology were to change, if we have the core ethos of what constitutes science and knowledge when it comes to something strongly pivoting towards welfare, I think we can stop those technologies from taking root as well. All those technologies that produce at the expense of animal welfare.
Yeah, and I cannot wait to see the amazing work that the Fish Welfare Initiative will do over the next decade, and certainly reducing the suffering of many, many fish. So we've talked a lot about fish welfare. I wanted to now talk a little bit about you and what got you started working in animal welfare.
All right. Okay. Well, I was just walking with a few friends. I just started my PhD in an altogether different field. And I was at Nalsar University, just taking a walk with a couple of my friends. So one of my friends just stops me and goes like, "Hey, I want to introduce you to a friend who is walking towards us." And her name is Noyanika. She works in this amazing center we have called the Animal Law Center. And that was just the beginning of it, I think. So I spoke to Nayanaka, found her work really interesting, and asked if I could work at her organization. And boom, like 2 weeks later, I was hired, basically. It was the sweetest thing. She did take my interest seriously, introduced me to her boss, and who then set up an interview with Jessima, who is one of the foremost advocates for animals in the country, and he gave me the job. So I started working at the Humane Society, and soon after I was hired, I started running the center. Luckily, thanks to all the support I got at the organization. So that's what got me started. But as far as the thinking, I think that's always been there. Like you said, you always, you said that you would be hurt even if a small insect were to be harmed in front of you. I think that's what I grew up with as well. Everyone from my grandmother to everyone around me really cared about animals, and they talked to me quite a bit about their suffering, and why it's not something that we should partake in. And it came with a lot of Brahminical undertones, which is the sad part there, but it did come. And I think at a later stage in life, I've been able to separate the two, thanks to where I went to college. At Jindal, I met Professor Vishwanathan, who really enabled me to kind of think more intelligently about animal protection in general. And so yeah, that's a little bit about where I come from, and what pushes me to do this work.
Yeah, and what does the day in a life look like?
It's very chaotic. There's a lot of chaos, obviously. And I like it. I like chaos. I never wanted to do a desk job that was altogether just writing down stuff and everything. I enjoy quite a bit of chaos in my work life. And I enjoy bringing order from chaos. So it's like, once I'm done handling, transforming one chaotic area, I move on to another, basically. That's kind of what my job is. And to that end, I think I make sure that, there's no day in the life off, honestly. It's so different. Yesterday was so different from today.
Yeah, and like a lot of people I've talked to have said the same thing. When it comes to working in animal welfare, no day is the same.
Right.
Do you have any advice for people who want to do stuff in animal welfare, who are considering, starting their career in it, as someone who's, had a lot of experience and done tremendous work?
I don't know if I have a lot of experience. But I do have advice for sure. I think it is, I'm a queer person, and the first organization I actually could proudly be myself was an animal welfare organization, right? So it's an extremely compassionate workspace. No matter where you come from, you'll find that the workplaces in the animal world are very compassionate, very giving, and that's one of the most important reasons to be part of it, because not only would you be doing great work, reducing tremendous suffering, like, you would also be doing it with people who would care for you, leaders who kind of wear that mantle of protecting folks from any background, and so on and so forth. So it's a very rewarding workplace. It's a both in terms of who you work with and in terms of what you do. So you should absolutely consider a career in animal welfare for that very reason. I've worked in a lot of places. I've worked in sustainable agriculture. I was teaching. I was doing, I was also working for one of those annoying call centers as well, who called people asking for payment on their car loan and stuff. So I worked in many organizations over the short work tenure that I've had. Maybe it's not short anymore. I think it's coming upon like 14 years or something. So everyone wants to think they're young, right? But yeah, but this was the most satisfying work and the most satisfying people, most satisfying group of people to work with, in many ways. Those are the two reasons why you should do it. And yeah, there's a whole score of other reasons as well, but these ones stand out, I think, for most people who do it.
Yeah, that's really good advice. And do you have any like thoughts you'd like to share about stuff that we haven't covered yet, or anything you wish you were asked?
Well, you were fairly thorough in what you were asking, so there's not much left to discuss, honestly. I'd just say that I think one of the important things that the movement has to do going forward is to work in countries like India. They're hard to set up, and you might not see a lot of initial momentum, but it's super hard. It's super important to try. I think India, China, Philippines, Vietnam, Malaysia, all these countries are, are places where there's tremendous suffering, and more investment and talent needs to be brought in to kind of change this dynamic. Basically, I think that's super important, and I want to stress on that very heavily.
Yeah, thank you so, so much, Karthik, for your time. I will say that I learned a lot about the work that the Fish Welfare Initiative does in terms of working with farmers, working with governments. I think it's phenomenal. And also a lot of stuff about fish welfare, more generally about like the interventions that should happen. And I think that fish welfare especially is a very neglected issue. And having organizations that work in places like India that do a lot of good in developing nations is so important for actually being able to help animals. And yeah, I just am so grateful for having had the opportunity to talk to you. It's been a real honor. And again, thank you so much for all that you do for animals.
No, thank you for talking to me and listening to me patiently and putting all this together. Uh, what you do is a very important part of getting all these dreams, that from happen. I mean, for these dreams to happen, basically. So thank you. You have a wonderful day.